A special thank you to each of our subscribers who make this channel possible. Here's today's story. In a significant move on Friday, the United States government announced sanctions against Cuban President Miguel Díaz-Canel and several high-ranking officials, citing human rights abuses as the primary justification for this action. This announcement coincides with the anniversary of the largest anti-government protests in Cuba in recent decades, which took place in July 2021. The sanctions include restrictions on visas for these officials, marking a firm stance from the U.S. in support of human rights and fundamental freedoms for the Cuban people. U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio took to social media platform X to communicate the decision, emphasizing that the State Department would enforce visa restrictions specifically targeting Cuban judicial and prison officials deemed responsible for the unjust detention and torture of protesters from the July 2021 demonstrations. These protests, which were not organized by any opposition group, erupted on July 11th and 12th, 2021, as citizens expressed their frustrations over the dire economic situation in Cuba, exacerbated by shortages of basic goods and services. Rubio stated, "The U.S. remains committed to supporting the human rights and basic liberties of the Cuban people. We want to make it clear that illegitimate, dictatorial regimes have no place in our region." This sentiment reflects a continuation of the U.S.'s policy towards Cuba, which has seen a shift in approach from the previous Trump administration's more aggressive tactics to the Biden administration's somewhat moderated stance. Alongside Díaz-Canel, the sanctions also targeted Cuban Defense Minister Álvaro López Mira and Interior Minister Lázaro Álvarez Casas. These officials were implicated in the violent crackdown on the protests, which resulted in one death and numerous injuries, with human rights organizations estimating that over 1,000 individuals were arrested during this period. The Cuban government, however, has not released official figures regarding the arrests, instead attributing the protests to a U.S.-led media campaign and decades of sanctions against the island. In response to the U.S. sanctions, Johanna Tablada, the deputy director of the U.S. Department in the Cuban Foreign Ministry, vehemently criticized Rubio, labeling him a defender of genocide, prisons, and mass deportations. This exchange highlights the ongoing tensions between the two nations, particularly regarding human rights issues and the treatment of political dissidents in Cuba. The protests of July 2021 were unprecedented in their scale and intensity, as citizens took to the streets in a rare display of dissent against the government. The demonstrations were sparked by a series of blackouts and deteriorating living conditions, with many people expressing their anger over the government's failure to address these pressing issues. The response from the Cuban authorities was swift, with reports of arrests and repression of dissenting voices. In the aftermath of the protests, Cuban prosecutors stated that around 790 individuals were investigated for their involvement in the demonstrations, though the government has not provided comprehensive data on the number of arrests or prosecutions. Human rights groups have continued to call for accountability and transparency regarding the treatment of those detained during the protests. The U.S.'s decision to impose sanctions is seen as a continuation of a long-standing policy aimed at pressuring the Cuban government to improve its human rights record. The sanctions are part of a broader strategy to hold accountable those in power who are believed to be complicit in human rights violations. Rubio's statements highlight the U.S.'s commitment to standing by the Cuban people in their struggle for freedom and basic rights. As the situation in Cuba continues to evolve, the international community is closely monitoring the developments. The U.S.'s actions may have significant implications for its relations with Cuba and the broader geopolitical landscape in the region. The Cuban government has long criticized U.S. sanctions as harmful to its economy and a violation of its sovereignty, and this latest round of sanctions is likely to exacerbate tensions between the two nations. In summary, the U.S. government's sanctions against Cuban leadership mark a notable escalation in its efforts to address human rights abuses on the island. As the anniversary of the protests serves as a reminder of the ongoing struggles faced by the Cuban people, the international community remains vigilant in advocating for human rights and fundamental freedoms. The coming months will be crucial in determining the trajectory of U.S.-Cuba relations and the future of human rights in Cuba. That's all for this story. We upload videos every day covering many different subjects, so hit that subscribe button to stay informed. Thanks for watching.